We begin with updates on the Israel-Hamas war as efforts to reach a truce continue. The United Nations Security Council is expected to vote on a U.S. resolution calling for an immediate and sustained ceasefire in Gaza for 6 weeks and the release of hostages. Now, it's important to note the use of the word immediate in the draft resolution, as Washington has refrained from using it while calling for a ceasefire. Now, the previous U.S. resolution, which was moved at the UN Security Council in February, called for a temporary ceasefire as soon as practical. Now, since the war began, the U.S. has vetoed 3 draft resolutions, 2 of which demanded an immediate ceasefire. In fact, just last month, Washington vetoed an Arab resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire. Now, Washington had said such an action could jeopardize talks and would interfere with negotiations surrounding the hostages. Earlier, the U.S. also was averse to the word ceasefire and vetoed measures that called for an immediate ceasefire. But the latest U.S. resolution marks a further toughening of Washington's stance towards Israel. In fact, the language backs talks brokered by Egypt and Qatar over a ceasefire. Now, in order for a resolution to pass in the Security Council, it will need at least 9 votes in favor and no veto by the permanent members of the Council. Those members include the United States, France, Britain, Russia, and China. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who's in Israel today, said he believes talks in Qatar could still reach an agreement.
The need for an immediate, sustained ceasefire with the release of hostages. That would create space to surge more humanitarian assistance to relieve the suffering of many people and to build something more enduring. We've been working, as you know, with Egypt, with Qatar, and with Israel to put a strong proposal on the table. Hamas responded to that. The negotiators continue to work. The gaps are narrowing, and we're continuing to push for an agreement in Doha. There's still difficult work to get there, but I continue to believe it's possible.
Now, the CIA and Mossad chiefs will be arriving in Qatar today to join the talks. And the main sticking point has been that Hamas says that it will release hostages only as part of a deal that would end the war, while Israel says it will discuss only a temporary pause. The Netanyahu government has continued to vow to eliminate Hamas. Now, the latest U.S. resolution also increases pressure on Israel to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza, where severe hunger is worsening and the United Nations warns of an imminent famine. The European Union leaders also called for a humanitarian pause in Gaza as well. And they also called for the unconditional release of all hostages and urged Israel to not proceed with a ground offensive in Rafah.
What's happening today in Gaza is the failure of humanity. It's not a humanitarian crisis. It's the failure of humanity. It's not a earthquake. It's not a flood. It's bombing. The only way of stopping this humanitarian crisis, human crisis, is Israel respecting more civilians and allowing more support to enter into Gaza.
The consensus of tonight is that we need an immediate humanitarian pause leading to a sustained ceasefire, the unconditional release of hostages, and the provision of humanitarian assistance. Gaza is on the verge of famine, a catastrophic humanitarian situation. Full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access into Gaza via all routes is essential.
Now, after European leaders huddled in Brussels, the focus today shifts to New York. Will the United Nations Security Council pass a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire after 5 months of war, or will the U.S. resolution be vetoed? Many questions, very, very few answers.